The true story of Canudos. The war that shook Brazil. Imagine a remote settlement in the Brazilian backlands. Thousands of people living together, far from the major cities, following a mysterious religious leader. They had little money, few weapons, almost no military training, and yet, this community would resist the Brazilian army in one of the bloodiest conflicts in Brazil's history. This was Canudos. And at the center of it all was a man known as Antônio Conselheiro. But how did a religious community become the target of an entire army? And why did the Brazilian government become so determined to destroy it? To understand what happened, we have to go back to the harsh Brazilian backlands of the 19th century. The backlands. In the late 1800s, life in Brazil's northeastern backlands was extremely difficult. Droughts devastated communities. Poverty was widespread. Many people had little access to education, healthcare, or political power. For thousands of poor families, life was a constant struggle for survival. And in this environment, a mysterious preacher began traveling through the region. Antônio Conselheiro. Antônio Conselheiro did not begin by creating an army. He was a religious figure. He traveled from place to place, preaching and gathering followers. But as his reputation grew, so did the number of people willing to follow him. Eventually, Conselheiro and his followers settled in an isolated area of Bahia. There, they established a community that became known as Canudos. And this is where the story becomes extraordinary. The city in the Sertão Canudos grew rapidly. Thousands of people came there seeking a different life. Former farm workers, poor families, religious followers, people escaping hardship, people who believed Conselheiro could offer them something the outside world could not. At its height, Canudos became a large settlement in the middle of the Sertão. But the community was not simply another village. Its growing independence worried local Brazil authorities. Itself was going through enormous political changes. In 1889, the monarchy had been overthrown. Brazil had become a republic, and the new government was still trying to establish its authority. Canudos existed far from the centers of power, and that made the government increasingly suspicious. The first conflict. Then came a dispute that would help transform Canudos into a national crisis. The community needed construction materials. An order of wood was purchased from a town outside Canudos, but the delivery did not arrive as expected. Rumors spread that the people of Canudos were preparing to attack. The authorities became alarmed, and in 1896, a military expedition was sent against the settlement. The government expected an easy victory. They were wrong. The first expedition. The soldiers entered the backlands, believing they were facing an unorganized group of religious followers. Instead, they encountered determined resistance. The terrain was difficult. The soldiers were unfamiliar with the region, and the defenders of Canudos knew the landscape. The expedition failed. The defeat shocked authorities, but instead of ending the conflict, it made the government even more determined to destroy Canudos. A second expedition was sent. It also failed. Then, a third. And again, the government forces suffered defeat. The community in the Sertão had become a symbol of resistance. The fourth expedition. By 1897, The Brazilian government could no longer treat Canudos as a minor local problem. A much larger military force was organized. Thousands of soldiers were sent to Bahia. This time, the mission was different. The government intended to destroy Canudos completely. The army advanced toward the settlement, but Canudos was not easily defeated. The defenders fought desperately. They knew they had almost no chance of winning a conventional war. But they also knew the land. They used the landscape to their advantage, and they fought with extraordinary determination. The siege. The fighting became increasingly brutal. Canudos was surrounded. Food became scarce. Water became a serious problem. The population suffered. And still, the resistance continued. The Brazilian army brought increasingly powerful weapons. Artillery was used against the settlement. The conflict became a war of survival. Inside Canudos, Antônio Conselheiro remained a powerful spiritual symbol for his followers. But the community was slowly being destroyed. The mystery of Canudos. And here is one of the most fascinating parts of the story. Why did so many people follow Antônio Conselheiro? Was Canudos simply a religious community? Was it a rebellion against the new republic? Or was it something much more complicated? Historians have debated these questions for generations. The fall of Canudos. By September 1897. Antônio Conselheiro was dead. The exact circumstances surrounding his death became part of the history and mythology surrounding Canudos. But his death did not immediately end the resistance. The final defenders continued fighting. Eventually, however, the settlement was overwhelmed. In October 1897, Canudos was destroyed. The community that had grown in the middle of the sertão was gone. Thousands of people had died during the conflict. The Brazilian army had won the war, but Canudos had left a wound in Brazilian history that would never completely disappear. Euclides da Cunha. And then something unexpected happened. A journalist and writer named Euclides da Cunha traveled to Bahia to report on the conflict. What he saw changed his understanding of Brazil. He studied the landscape, the people, the soldiers, the destruction, and the enormous distance between the Brazilian government and the people of the sertão. Later, he transformed his experience and research into one of the most important books in Brazilian literature, Os Sertões, the Backlands. The book was published in 1902. It was not simply a story about a war. It was an attempt to understand Brazil itself. The legacy. More than a century later, Canudos remains one of the most fascinating episodes in Brazilian history. It was a story about faith, poverty, politics, power, and resistance. But perhaps the most important lesson is that Canudos was not simply a story about an army defeating a village. It was a story about a country struggling to understand itself. A new republic confronted a population living in a very different reality, and the result was catastrophic. Today, the name Canudos still carries the memory of the people who lived there. Their community disappeared, but their story survived. And thanks in part to Euclides da Cunha's Os Sertões, the tragedy of Canudos became impossible to erase from Brazilian history, because sometimes the most important stories are not about the people who win. They are about the people whose struggle forces an entire country to look at itself. And Canudos was one of those stories. This was the true story of Canudos.